Hello and welcome everybody to this, the first of 3 webinars brought to you by the Africa CEO Forum on climate change and how it has impacted Africa and the continent's hopes for growth and development. It is, of course, climate change, one of the world's most significant current challenges. My name is Peter Humey, and I will be asking a distinguished panel of diplomats, scientists and experts with first-hand experience of the issue for their views. We look forward to your participation as well. You will be able to interact with our panel by posting your questions. It's quite simple. Post your questions, put your questions into the Q&A tab of your Zoom. It's at the bottom of the Zoom app page. And possibly let us know which of the panelists you might like to direct your questions to. We will look through the questions and then pass them on to the panelists. And we look forward to getting many, many questions. Now, I'm delighted to welcome the Ambassador of Uganda to France, Her Excellency Doreen Ruth Amule. Madam Ambassador, good morning and welcome to you.
Mr. Speaker.
Thanks for taking time off from your
My pleasure.
busy schedule. Uganda naturally wants prosperity for its people, and yet the continent of Africa is struggling with the consequences of the most significant impacts of anywhere in the world, really, of climate change. And I should add that the consequences are essentially not of Africa's own making. So let's begin with how Africa is coping with, obviously, the demand for domestic energy and the people's natural desire for growth and a prosperous future.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter, for this opportunity to come and speak about Africa and Uganda in particular in regards to energy and also how to cope up with energy challenges that Uganda and any other African country faces. Right away, I can tell you that, for example, in Uganda, we've had a law in place right from 2002 that has been a model framework for and guidance for our consumption, implementation, investment as far as energy is concerned. And also, Uganda is one of the countries that has a very positive thinking towards eradicating or reducing the greenhouse emission and climate change. And in regards to that, Uganda is one of the countries that has ratified a number of legal frameworks, both at the national, international level, regional level, and also sub-regional level, and within the country, the laws that governs energy policies, energy consumption, energy production, and also reaching and touching the lives of the local person. But away from that, it's a very an open fact that Uganda is still one of the African countries, like any other country in Africa, is struggling and grappling with how to meet the demand of the population. For example, as we talk now, it's less than 50% of the population of over 40 million people are connected to the grid of the electricity, be it solar, be it hydro, be it gas, and whatever. Mm-hmm. So this is a challenge, and the challenge comes as a result of lack of finances that is purely geared towards energy development. And yet it is in the vision of the country to look at energy as a source of development, increased standard of a living, a good life for the people, source of production, and also health, looking at all these put together. So this gives me a question of how best do we do it? So the country in its own way is putting in a lot of measures, bringing in policies, ratifying, and also going by what other country, be it in Africa or in the whole globe, is doing towards meeting the climate change and greenhouse emissions. Mm-hmm. And the other challenge is where Uganda is right now. First of all, we agree, and every other person agrees, that Uganda, just like African countries, again, I repeat this by saying, in the report of IEA, recently we attended a meeting here in Paris, states that the green gas emission that is now causing the climate change in the whole world, when you put all African countries together, is either slightly or not even equal to emission caused by New York City in America. Just one city, leave alone others. So that means right now we as Africa, we are actually paying for what we did not do. But we're saying, okay, fine, the world is ours, the globe is ours. You are not going to sit back and say, okay, because we did not contribute, therefore we cannot do anything. We cannot do nothing.
Right.
That's why we have policies in the place. That's why we have agreed to a lot of ratifications, like the Paris, the Paris, what do I say?
The Paris Accords, the Paris
yes,
agreements.
2016, 2026, I think.
Yeah.
And we have also agreed to the UN ratifications. We have also agreed to a lot of energy regulations within the country that leads us to clean energy consumption. But we are also still grappling with a lot of high poverty level within the country. And when we talk about poverty level, in relations to energy consumption, we see that this is not yet matching. We have a lot of our people who cannot access clean energy. We have a lot of our people who cannot afford even the purchase of what could be produced. We have a lot of our people who cannot even still go into manufacturing and industrialization.
So there is still a long way to go, obviously, heading in the right direction.
Yes.
I hate to interrupt you, but we're going to resume with more questions for you, and you can expand on some of the ideas. I need to move on now, so don't go away. We'll be coming back. And a reminder to all our viewers, post those questions, if you will, please. Right, let's turn now to Mr. Todd Moss. He is the Executive Director of Energy for Growth Hub and is a former Secretary at the Bureau of African Affairs. I hope I've got the information correct there, at the US State Department. Todd joins us now from Washington, D.C. So, Todd, thanks very much for getting up so early in your day to be with us. We certainly appreciate your presence. Let me start by asking you about the seemingly endless quest among European nations to get Africa to produce more gas. It's a result of what is happening in Ukraine, of course, and the fact that Europe is facing a dramatic drop in supplies from Russia. Are we seeing any signs, though, that Europe is putting its hands in its pockets to finance increased gas or other energy production in Africa?
Yeah, so thanks, Peter. All countries prioritize energy security, jobs, and keeping energy prices low is a top priority everywhere. That's true in Europe, it's true in the United States, it's true in Africa. So we should certainly expect, we should not be surprised that Germany, for example, which has been trying to lead on the energy transition, the German leader has, since the Ukraine war, already made 3 trips to West Africa to sign long-term gas contracts. So it seems hypocritical, but it's what we should expect. I would say the issue in Africa is really that, as the ambassador suggested, there's just not enough energy investment coming into the region, and not enough energy is making it to people, and particularly to companies that can create jobs. So, I'm very struck by how stark global energy inequality is. I got one of my light bulb moments in energy policy was shopping for a refrigerator with my family. And in the United States, there's a little yellow Energy Star tag that tells you how much electricity every appliance uses. And the refrigerator that I bought and that's running in my house uses more electricity than an average person in Africa, which is insane. That's not a world that is one that's going to be prosperous, safe, or a kind of world that I think we all want to live in. So that's solving energy inequality has got to go hand in hand with solving the global climate change crisis.
Right. Well, as we were listening to you, Todd, Madam Ambassador here was nodding her head in agreement, I think, with the remarkable fact that one fridge in the United States is often using more energy than many individuals on the African continent. Just to follow up a question on, is gas a viable energy course for African nations? It seems to be that local production often does not serve the local population and is destined for export in most cases. Can natural gas meet both export and local domestic demands? So it's a big question, I guess.
Yeah, so I kind of hate questions which say, like, what's the best energy source for a particular country? Because it's going to depend on the resources they have. So a country like Kenya is going to use, they're using their own geothermal resources. They've got Africa's biggest wind farm. Ethiopia is using its hydro resources. A country like Nigeria is using its gas. And that's also, again, what Europeans and the United States do. We've got an energy mix that's based on the resources we have. And so, again, we should expect African countries to use what makes sense for them. Now, does gas make sense? In some places, having gas in your energy mix will make a lot of sense. Gas pairs very nicely with intermittent renewables like solar and wind because first, it can ramp up and down quickly, so it pairs nice in a technical sense. But it also pairs very nicely because the finances are the exact opposite. So a solar farm, for example, is almost entirely upfront capital cost and very low running cost, whereas a gas plant is the opposite. It's cheap to build but costly to run. So having that your finances like that helps you balance out both technically and financially to have a low cost, reliable energy system. So I would absolutely expect countries, particularly those with sizable offshore natural gas. So this would include Mozambique, Tanzania, Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, these countries to have some gas in their mix, but as part of a low cost, overall low carbon energy system so they can exploit the declining costs of these other energy technologies.
Yes, it's it's obviously it's a fairly complicated business trying to balance both sides of the issue, of course. Todd, for the time being, thank you very much. We'll be back around to you again shortly. And now our third panelist, Molly Bodimowo welcome, Molly, to the webinar. You join us from Casablanca in Morocco, where you serve as the Strategy Director for Africa 50, an infrastructure investment platform that operates throughout the continent and a member of the Africa CEO Forum. So double welcome to you. Molly, how would you describe, in fact, just paint a brief picture for us of what is Africa 50's remit?
All right. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for inviting me to an Africa 50 to contribute to this important discussion today. So we're always pleased to exchange in the international community, in this case, talking about energy. And first, let me describe to those on the audience who haven't heard about Africa 50 before. So, like Peter said, we are an infrastructure investment platform. What that means is that we work to help create an end-to-end pipeline of projects, in this case, to fill the infrastructure gap. I've heard a lot of what Madam Ambassador and Todd have said about energy poverty and that very stark reality of trying to meet energy demand. But what is sort of missing in that equation is infrastructure. Just like a farmer who has seeds and has water, if you don't put the seeds in the water and effectively water it, you're not going to get the plants necessary to feed the people. And it's the same thing with infrastructure. What Africa 50 does is help fulfill a three-part mandate, and in that way, creating the infrastructure needed to provide that energy at an affordable price for people who need it. So the first is in project development. And we see that as a very important part of Africa 50 and Africa's solution, because it helps create projects that can be ready for financing and that it increases the chance of success. Just to give some quotes out there, usually when a project is started and trying to get to financial close, only 10% of it, according to McKinsey, makes it to financial close. So it's incredibly important to have the right necessary levels of expertise, skills, documentation, and partnership to bring a project from conception to financial close. And that's what project development does with ease. I'll give an example up front, which we'll probably talk about later, and that is of Benban, which is a solar plant, or a set of solar plants, based in Egypt, in Aswan. We were able to work with our partners, the Egyptian government, who is a shareholder, as well as Scatec Solar and the Norfund, based in Norway, to help build 6 power plants based on solar, double PV, as Todd will probably be aware. And basically, in about 2.5 years, take a project from its middle, high level, very idea sort of base into 6 operating plants that is providing energy to the Egyptian population. Right now, just from recent checking, it's about 420,000 households. That is the type of impact that we want to see, and that is the type of impact that Africa needs. We also do in Africa 50 accelerating infrastructure, and also, due to Madam Ambassador's point, mobilizing capital, domestic and international, to fill that climate gap and infrastructure gap for funding. I stop here.
So, thank you. Very detailed answer there. A very interesting one as well. It's certainly concerning the Aswan project with all those solar panels. 250,000 people, I think, are benefiting from that particular project. Let me turn again now to Madam Ambassador, if I may. Your government has recently said that the energy transition strategy in Uganda will be a key part of the country's participation. It's what it's going to highlight in its participation of COP28, which is less than a month away now. Is the plan to ensure that Uganda meets all its net zero targets on deadline? It's quite a big ask, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. Yes, Uganda commitment to just a few days to reach 28th target goal. We are on track, but I may say that we may be a bit delayed. Again, this takes us to parameters to which we were able to or not able to achieve this. Is that currently we have the policies in place, we have the goodwill, we have the implementers in place. We are trying to galvanize all the energies of both government and the people involved in achieving these targets. But we are still yet to say, how do we relate what we want to achieve with the realities on the ground? So you may find that there's a big gap between the reality on the ground and also our ambitions to achieve this target. That is what I know for a fact that is going to lag us behind, or it has already lagged us behind. But the positive enthusiasm and the energies towards achieving this is there. That's why we are looking forward to 2032, that at this level, we shall be in position to have moved a great percentage. And also, I think we cannot yet meet that target if we still have over 90% of the population still clinging towards bio energy that they're utilizing. And also, we still have a huge financial challenges in implementing our dream or strategies to achieve this goal.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So maybe not quite meeting the deadline is the message that I'm getting from you, but not far behind. the deadline? You'll remain within
On
a
course.
year or
We
two
remain
or
on course,
three
yeah.
within
We
them.
remain
All
on
right.
course.
Very good. Let's go back to Todd in Washington. Todd, if I can ask you, a fair amount of investment in African energy goes into smaller scale local rural projects such as the photovoltaic solar panels. We heard Molly talk about, in this case, a very large solar panel project in Aswan in Egypt. But in many other countries, these are small scale operations. Is it simply a matter of costs and being able to afford the big operations that will go to serve industry and urban areas in many parts of Africa?
Yeah, so again, like the question around what kinds of energy technologies are best, and that you want a whole range of energy technologies. A resilient energy system is a diverse energy system. That also applies to delivery systems. And so, we hear a lot about solar home systems, mini grids, and other off-grid energy systems. And those are actually a wonderful addition to our arsenal to tackle energy poverty. I would just caution that that you still will need the large-scale industrial power. You'll still need a grid, particularly if you're going to want to create industry and create jobs. So where the off-grid systems can play a very crucial role is in replacing very costly last-mile grid connections. The grid in Uganda, for example, they have made a very smart strategic decision to focus largely on the urban areas for the grid, and they've got a separate plan for rural areas because, of course, rural electrification is very, very costly. So these off-grid systems can provide basic electricity to people quicker than waiting for the grid. Mini grid systems can now provide some power at a relatively high cost, but some power for small businesses that are far from the grid. But again, we shouldn't be saying, here's one solution that's going to solve all of Africa's energy needs. Solar home systems, mini grids, and the large grid are all have a role to play in building an energy system that's going to meet the needs of more than 2 billion people by 2050, and particularly the job needs and the job requirements for all of those young people who will be leaving school between now and 2050.
Right. And Todd, in fact, we have a question directed to you from a member of the public who's tuned in to Zoom with us today. The question is, you mentioned Germany attempting to source gas from West Africa. You also said that this could be seen as somewhat hypocritical, I think. And Germany itself is seemingly returning to coal to power its domestic needs. Do Western leaders and population realize that their demands that Africa does not rely on fossil fuels? Is it hypocritical, contradictory? Can you throw any more light on and answer our viewers' question on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, all governments have hypocritical policies. I'm a former U.S. diplomat, so I can say that now. And I think we try to make an attempt to be as equal as possible. But really, the issue for Africa and African energy and the financing issue from, say, Germany or the United States, the United States is still, we're closing our coal plants, but we're still adding gas capacity in the United States. The issue is really is around finance for upstream versus downstream finance. So if a company wants to produce gas in Nigeria to export to Germany, they can get that capital on the international market. This is, Molly has talked about how essential it is to get the infrastructure investment. So getting that upstream infrastructure investment, if it's for export, you can go to the capital markets, no problem. For downstream investment, which might be for, say, a power plant in Nigeria, the capital markets will not finance that. You're going to need either a government guarantee or some intervention from, say, a German agency or the World Bank. And it's that downstream finance where where the restrictions are really starting to squeeze. So the result of that is that you're seeing finance available for African gas if it's going to be consumed in Europe, but you will not see finance for African gas if it's going to be consumed by Africans, and that is literally the opposite of climate justice. And that's something that I think we're starting to hear from African leaders about that. Many of the African heads of state have been raising this issue since at least COP26, and I would expect that we'll hear a lot about this at COP28.
Right. Okay. Um, Good point. Good point in terms of us first from the Western point of view. I'm going to bring Molly back in now. I think, Molly, you want to react to something that Todd has just said.
Yes, I just wanted to build on Todd's point of the different scales of infrastructure that's required in the country. So like Todd said, mini grids and those interventions are useful depending on how they're used, especially the way that Uganda has used it. But I just wanted to call some examples to light of Africa actually building large-scale infrastructure. And just to put some thoughts out there in the ether, Africa currently builds more renewable projects than traditional ones. So if anything, we're actually doing everything that we can to muster towards a more renewable and clean and green than the perception perhaps of us sticking with just fossil fuels and things of that nature. It's not the case. So Todd spoke about Lake Turkana, 310 megawatts of wind, probably one of the largest in the continent, if not the world. There's Benban Solar, even though we contributed 400 megawatts to it. The total size of the Benban Solar part is 1.5 gigawatts. You can see it from space. It's that big, third largest in the world. There's also the Noor solar plant in Morocco, 580 megawatts. And there's other different examples of huge sustainable types of energy provision that African countries are trying to do. But that being said, it's just a limited amount. Why? Because it's being provided by public sources, and government sources can only go so far when faced with an issue like this. You need private sector interventions and funding to get into. And that is one of the areas where Africa 50 considers it its mandate to bring and leverage and connect the public with the private from an infrastructure and a financing perspective to build more infrastructure like that from a medium, large, and a long-term basis.
Okay. I think Todd's nodding his head in agreement there. So, Molly, let me just follow up. You mentioned the private investment. As we are fully aware, the West, certainly in Europe, there's high inflation, high interest rates. There doesn't seem to be a lot of spare cash sloshing around in people's coffers. Are you relying more, would you say, on private African investment than maybe government investment from Europe? What's the balance looking like at the moment?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. It's been a very interesting couple of years. As you know, there's been a dearth in sort of getting climate finance, and Africa currently receives only 3% of it. So technically, there's a financing gap of about $240 billion a year. However, what we've been able to see within these same past couple of years is that because of the topic of climate being such a carrying call across the different North and Global South, if you may, we have been able to bring investors together to provide financing towards funds and vehicles to help provide infrastructure. From our perspective, we actually started a fund called the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. And usually in Africa, when you set up funds, you look towards the likes of your World Bank, your International Finance Corporation, developmental finance institutions in the West to be able to fund that. And then maybe you can go into your local community and find money. We decided to go inward first, to see and say that we wanted our own domestic resources to be able to finance our needs. So for us, by us, well, us first, as you would say. And what we found was that in our attempt to fund our part of our first close, which we're aiming for around, say, maybe 200 million, 17 African institutions and one international investor accepted the call to come together to fund that amount, which is historical. I don't believe that has actually happened across different financial institutions. So to answer your question first of three parts, we are finding domestic solutions. They are seeing the importance of being able to contribute to such an important topic, such as investing in infrastructure as well as for climate. And that is leveraging and bringing international global investments sort of in. The second way, and there's two more, the second way is, because it's close to my heart, this topic, is actually through partnerships. So we have actually been working with the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank ourselves, and global institutions world over, from the United States, Europe, Middle East, all over, to create this initiative that can invest and scale up green infrastructure all over Africa. We're hoping to raise up to 500 million of that in order to leverage and finance up to 10 billion of climate infrastructure for the continent. And I will say, come COP28, hopefully we'll be able to make announcements of those institutions in Africa and in the West coming together to say that we will stand and commit said funding to be able to solve this climate issue and make the steps towards it. I'll even go a step further. For the case when if someone were to ask me, well, that's very nice. You have people from all over coming to the world, but what about the governments themselves? What do you do now? Well, I have a solution for you. The infrastructure that's been created that is probably still generating assets, that has value in that too. And what we've been saying to governments is that you can actually commission out that infrastructure, commission that over to private consortiums or groups of private institutions, and you can get money for that. We call that asset recycling. So you can take your well-performing assets that is sitting on your books, that has value, but you're not doing anything with it, and you can turn that into investment for infrastructure, for green as well as needed infrastructure and the social front. So I've given you three ways where we can find the money, and we're pretty confident that together by working on these innovative approaches, that we'll be able to move forward towards solving that money problem.
Right. Again, thank you very much for a comprehensive answer there, Molly, in Casablanca. If I can turn again now to Madam Ambassador here with me in the studio. We heard what Molly and Todd have had to say. There's a lot of collaborations, there's a lot of organizations that can potentially be involved in raising funds, finding investors, as Molly has indicated. What is the situation in Uganda in terms of collaboration with other nations, maybe in the region, in the process or in the progress towards clean energy, renewables, and other issues concerning the environment, possibly?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I was glad to hear from Molly that they've been asking government, first of all, to partner with private persons so that they can have a recycling of assets in whatever we have. Uganda has done that a lot. I think for a couple of years, my government has always given out a section of energy, especially hydro, that is being managed by private individuals. In order to, first of all, extend, we have rural electrification that is done by private companies, and also we have UDCL that is also being manned by a different sector. We have public-private partnership with the individual companies that run this sector of the energies as one of the means to mitigate the financial costs and also to bring in resources to invest into the energy.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that answer. If just briefly, if I can go back to Molly, please. We're talking about Uganda with the ambassador, of course. What has Africa 50's involvement been with Uganda? Do you have any specifics for us on that?
Well, I would say that the closest specific I can give is on a regional level, but there is a topic that I think is quite near and dear to Uganda's heart, and that is actually an energy transmission. As you know, there's a lot of interest now talking about energy generation, and there's plenty of examples you can give to that. But right now, I would say that transmission is probably a very important topic because you need to be able to evacuate the energy to the areas where it's needed. And currently, transmission assets are funded, raised, owned, all by public money and governments. we feel there's an opportunity here, and we've actually started working with Uganda's neighbor, Kenya, to create Africa's first public-private transmission project, 2 lines of 230 kilometers. And we believe that we should be able to prove that the public-private partnership model can apply in transmission as well as in generation. We are also trying to expand this model. So not only do we think that this is going to happen in Kenya, we can also see potential in Tanzania, certainly Uganda. So Madam Ambassador, this is a public call to, if you're interested in working with us on that and creating some concept towards that, we'd be more than happy to engage you on it, but also across the continent as well. So there's opportunities in Nigeria, in Egypt, and several other areas where transmission is definitely the place to sort of look at.
Okay, all right, thank you, Molly. We'll come back to Todd in just a moment, but just a follow-up sort of question to Madam Ambassador here. Electrification is going to be a key issue in terms of supplying energy to the population, of course. Forestation is also an issue, I think, in some parts of Uganda. How widespread is electrical power actually available in Uganda?
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for that beautiful question. First of all, we are looking at electrification, just Molly, as Molly said, there is production of power and also transmission of the power to the person that should consume it, either for production or for domestic use and whatsoever. But in Uganda right now, we still have a challenge where less than 50% of the population of over 45 million people are connected to the grids of whatever source, and that translates to consumption of other sources of energy, which is being used by the population, and most especially the biogas. And if that is what is consumed by a number of like 90% of the population, it means people resort to deforestation. And deforestation that people resort to is because, first of all, because of lack of available and affordable energy sources. And for example, I can tell you a case of my own case, where in my village, as who I am, leave alone that person who is at that level, at the level of an ambassador, my own village has never seen any connection of electricity. There's no connectivity, not even one pole of electricity like this. So that means for all this generation of my 4 grandparents, and then up to my parents, up to me, when I go to my village, what I consume is actually charcoal. That means it comes from trees. So there has to be a very big balance, and I'm still thankful to Molly for this development of having government and also countries being able to co-partner with them and transmit electricity and not only generate to the local people. I think that would bridge the gap. But as we talk now, Uganda previously, I think about 20 or so years ago, the green coverage, the vegetation coverage was up to over 20%. But right now, as we talk, it's even 12 or less in the country. So that shows you, and this is coupled with a growing population, because by 2002, the population of Uganda was only 21.57 million people. But right now, we are talking about 45 million people. So all this population, 90% of them are dependent on the cutting of trees, using of firewood, and so on. So there is still need of not only producing energy, but also having people getting connected. But that is also not possible if the cost of fuel is still being high. If Uganda is still even importing what we are calling fossil oil.
Right.
And also the electricity, the cost for which, by the time it reaches the last consumer, most of the population cannot have. And this is also related to the standard of living of the people. So there is a lot of mixed which is within that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the reality of the situation in parts of Uganda, well, quite remarkable, really. Where you come from, there's still village. There's still no electricity.
No.
Todd, I believe you want to jump in and add to something that we've heard from Madam Ambassador here with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ambassadors articulated just how deep energy poverty is in a place like Uganda. But I think it's very important for us to think about where the global economy is going. The modern economy runs on electrons. We are moving to electrify everything, and that is going to be exacerbated by climate change. Climate change means we're going to need more energy, not less. That's more energy for things like air conditioning, more energy for the digital economy. Again, to create jobs and to create climate resilience, everyone's going to need a lot more energy. Now, we've heard statistics around what percentage of a population has access to electricity. The numbers can be quite shocking. There's almost 700 million people in Africa without access to any electricity. But even those with access, they actually don't consume very much, in part because they're poor, but in large part because electricity is not very reliable. So something that you're going to start hearing about, including at COP28, is something we call the modern energy minimum, which is trying to get everyone not just to a very basic amount of electricity for a few lights, but to, we're setting that new threshold at 1,000 kilowatt hours per person. And that would cover not just household lighting, but also electricity in the wider economy. This is a new standard that can help to link electrification to higher standards of living and to higher incomes. And it's something where we feel that if the world makes a commitment to something like the modern energy minimum, that can help to close that gap at the climate negotiations, where a lot of countries, especially in Africa, feel like their energy needs are not getting the priority that they deserve.
Right. Just to be clear on the numbers, the minimum, Todd, you're saying is 1,000 kilowatts a day?
1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year.
Oh, for a year?
Per year.
Right. A day would be probably, okay.
Yeah, divide that by 365.
So it's per year.
But if you, the issue is that the current standard, the current standard, if you hear that 50% of the population in Uganda has electricity access, that means that they're consuming at least 50 kilowatt hours per year. That's the minimum in rural areas. We're trying to set that at 1,000 because I use more than 50 kilowatt hours in a day. So that doesn't seem like a very sufficient standard.
Okay, yes. I would imagine there's a huge discrepancy, obviously, between the West and other parts of the world in terms of consumption. I think that goes without saying. Thank you, Todd, for mentioning the modern energy minimum, something that is going to feature at COP28 in a few weeks' time. Molly, just to stay in the region of East Africa, I understand that Africa 50 is quite heavily involved with various projects in East Africa, including Uganda. You mentioned Kenya, you mentioned Tanzania. Why is that? Why is East Africa sort of providing so many potential positive projects for the Africa 50 and its shareholders and stakeholders?
Well, first I'll preface that by saying that East Africa, while it's a great region from its natural resources to its sort of government and its people bringing together several eco-hubs and ecosystems, let's not forget there are several other regions in the continent that are also quite attractive for investment. Taking from North Africa, you have Egypt, you have Morocco, of course, that not only is sort of almost like a gateway gateway between Africa, Europe, Middle East, and to an extent the US, but it also has, just like Uganda, taken a lot of good measures in terms of bringing the right type of investment and the right types of laws and foundations and frameworks to sort of have that investment and participation in projects and such. Same thing with West Africa. If I go a little bit low, I can count several countries. So Ghana, recent sort of changes taking place within Nigeria, Senegal, absolutely. And if I can just go all over the continent and indicate that there are several regions that have great opportunities that Africa 50 participates in. So even though we have, actually, I don't know if I said this before, we have 31 African countries as shareholders, along with the African Development Bank and 2 central banks. But we also have projects across 23 countries. And that is basically, it shows that we have a range of opportunities and a range of interactions that we do within that. But let me go back to your question. The East Africa region, I think, has been blessed with several different advantages. First, going to Kenya, it has most of its power is from renewables, from your geothermal to now recently with wind and solar. It currently has 93% of renewable energy being supplied by that. Tanzania, we spoke a little bit about Tanzania having a lot of gas assets. They're also looking at renewable energy as well, but they have gas. And just like other countries in the region, there's a range of different innovations. I guess we can talk about M-Pesa because they're responsible for mobile money as well. But they have innovations, and like Todd said, they have assets that they should be used. So we see a very good blend of that taking place in Kenya, not just in energy, I say in the East Africa region. So in terms of energy, in terms of ICT, in terms of health, there's several opportunities. But let me move a little bit and go back to the main point in the discussion that Todd and Madam Ambassador were having, and that was sort of on gas. I would just like to kind of say that I believe that, and actually Africa 50 stands behind having natural gas as part of that conversation for the energy mix. In fact, I believe that conversation should take place and should be brought to the fore more openly. And not just because it's good in terms of being a good balance against intermittent energy, in which case it is, but also for 2 reasons. First, it helps spur the development that Africa as a continent needs. There's several countries that have gas as a natural asset that can be used for development from an industrial purpose, not just an export. So that's one reason. The second is actually to what Madam Ambassador was speaking about in her village and her personal experience. And you can use natural gas for clean cooking. I don't think people underestimate, I think people actually don't know and underestimate the impact that not having clean cooking or using charcoal or biomass does. 4 million people every year die from illnesses related to cooking with charcoal and things of that nature. Honestly, for me, it's straightforward. Natural gas saves lives. Clean cooking saves lives. And that, along with those other advantages, should have a natural gas involved within the transition of mix, and it should be part of the just transition. Sorry if I'm being a bit, but that's where I stand.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Madam Ambassador, do you want to just react to the charcoal versus natural gas?
That's very true. That's why I can only react and saying what Molly says is very true. And having a population that cannot have access to natural gas or clean gas is really disastrous. It also contradicts the development pattern of the country, because first of all, it's time consuming, it degrades environment, and it is health wise, it is costly. That means to go to the constraint of the health sector and to also drain the economy. So having a thinking of having natural gas as a source of energy for the population solves a number on a good range of challenges that each country would be having and the whole world would be having.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Todd, let's bring you back in DC. Before I pose the question to you, just an encouragement to our viewers to put your questions on the Zoom app down in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. We're looking forward to getting a few more questions from you, the viewers. And let's go now to Todd. According to a recent report by the International Energy Agency and the African Development Bank, delivering what they say is modern energy, let alone a minimum of modern energy, to all African countries and populations will require about $25 billion, that's their figure, a year over the next 7 years. In your opinion, we've heard about natural gas and so forth. What's the best way, in your experience or in your opinion, certainly, to finance this kind of progress in energy resources? It's difficult to move people away from, we've had the example from Madam Ambassador where you're using charcoal because at the moment there is no alternative. You can't just say, okay, as of tomorrow you're no longer allowed to use charcoal. How should investment be placed? If you would take care of that question.
Sure. So in Africa, the investment in building a modern energy system is going to be not that dissimilar from how it's happened in Asia, Europe, and North America, which is going to be on a base of public investment, and then the real driver is going to be private investment. I'm really glad Molly raised transmission. If we jump back 10 years ago, the big barrier to the power system in Africa was getting money into generation. Today, if you build a project, you create a bankable project, capital will go there. In many countries right now, the barrier is largely from transmission or utility financial stress on the distribution side. So we're going to need a combination of enabling infrastructure, especially transmission, combined with private investment, largely in the generation side. And one issue that we will definitely be hearing a lot about at COP28 is the cost of capital. So the rise of interest rates in Western countries has also driven rates higher everywhere. And rates in Africa are extremely high right now. So it's at the point right now where a virtually identical solar farm that would cost more than twice as much in Ghana versus the United States, solely because of differences in interest rate expectations. So we're definitely going to, if we want to see a flood of much more capital, we're going to need we're going to need instruments to help drive down some of those risk premiums and get lower cost, longer term capital into Africa's energy sector. And I think that's possibly going to be one of the very, very top line issues coming out of COP.
Right. Okay. Are you actually planning to go yourself, Todd, to COP28 in the UAE? Are you be in attendance?
Probably not. Probably not. No, but many of my colleagues and allies will be there. I think I've written about this on my Substack, but I think there's a bit of summit fatigue. So, there's a COP every year. There are two World Bank IMF meetings. There's a spring meeting and a fall annual meeting. There was just an Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. There was a Paris Financing Summit in June. So, I think that this cycle of summits can get quite exhausting, not just for the participants, but also for people who are supposed to be actually implementing these projects. So I am going to stay in Washington, D.C. and get some work done rather than go to another big meeting.
Okay, so you'll be keeping track of events from your observation post, as we hear so often a description in the media. Okay, thank you, Todd. Madam Ambassador, if I can ask you another question. You mentioned hydropower, obviously something that has great potential in Uganda.
Sure.
And I understand that fossil fuels in the sense of oil production is expected to come on tap from the west region of Uganda in a couple of years' time. So there's still a need for fossil fuel and renewable kind of energy, right, at this moment in many African countries. But speak to what's going on in Uganda, if you would.
Yeah, what's going on in Uganda right now is a drive to try and meet, first of all, the energy demand, as well as solving the development challenges that the country faces. And I'm happy to say that when I heard what my colleague was talking about in relations to Germany, when it came to energy demand, and also I'm glad to say that we all appreciate that energy goes hand in hand with development, standard of life, and achieving all these aspects of life. Now, in this case, Uganda, without even producing fossil oil, is consuming fossil oil. So that means we are already being constrained as a country in importing very expensive fossil oil that runs almost 90% of our movables. That is industries, cars, and so on in the whole country. So that is already a challenge on our side. And also we should appreciate the fact that each country would be on a better side to use the resources available towards bridging the gap of energy challenges, which emanates also to the standard of living, and also it inculcates into the poverty level and poverty reduction.
Right.
So that's why Uganda, being endowed with oil and gas, we are looking at exploration, but of course putting in all the measures to reduce as much as possible the emission and carbon percentage. And we are looking at this in relation to private partnership to solve the challenge of finances.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. In fact, we have a question that is not unrelated to what you have just said that's come in now.
Yes.
The question is, it's up there on the screen in front of us, how should African government and business leaders promote, on the global scale, these consumption positive initiatives like the modern energy standard and Africa 50's calls to energy investment, so that they are heard in Europe, Asia, and America, where the financing pools are maybe the deepest. In other words, where there is more money possibly available there. So that's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's one of the very interesting questions. So what we are now looking at is, first of all, having the private sector come and play a key role into this investment to, first of all, try to raise up the energy consumption, the availability of energy, and probably transmission to the people, and bridging the gap between consumption, availability, development, industrialization, and all sectors of the government economy, and relating to what has been going on in the insufficiency. We are looking at private involvement, and private investment involvement means bringing in the resources that bridges the gap. So that's what we are looking at. But however, we are also facing challenges where African countries, Uganda in particular, is being looked at as going contradictory to what the whole globe is now looking at. But what we're saying is, where do we go? Should we have a balance between development and transition, that one has to take place, then the other comes in? Or should we just have a cutoff point and say this is where the world has gone? We are saying as a country, no. Can we have the resources available help us bridge the gaps, solve the challenges that we are having within the country as far as transmission is concerned, the grids building, the development of all the infrastructure, and then we balance this. That's why we have all the consciousness by putting in places all the laws and also subscribing to all international laws and treaties that governs the emission of carbon. And we are looking at the oil not only as a source of energy, but also as a bridge between the challenges that the government, the people of Uganda have as far as development and also livelihood is concerned. And that is where Uganda is going.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Does the figure of 25 billion that the IEA and the African Development Bank says is required every year over the next 7 years. Is that something that rings true? Do you know what the numbers would be ideal in aid for Uganda in terms of budget? Do we have any kind of figures yet? Maybe not.
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Over to Molly. Molly, you want to react to some comments and add to the conversation, I understand.
Yes, I would. So the discussion you, Madam Ambassador, and yourself were having was basically on how Africa can actually be part of the solution. We definitely have some opinions, and I've shared some already in terms of how to do that. But I think it's more than just seeing where our massive needs and how we can sort of bring innovations and partnerships to do so. So I'm going to give an example of a partnership that is going to happen and that I think can be scaled up to help bring in the private sector participation needed to meet these gaps, including the 25 billion of which you speak. So just recently, the United Arab Emirates came and announced a 4.5 billion initiative called the Africa Green, I'm trying to remember. But in any case, this 4.5 billion is going to be dedicated to investing in clean energy infrastructure throughout Africa. I believe it's going to be up to the tune of 15 gigawatts by 2030. The UAE is starting an amazing initiative, partnering with Africa 50 as a strategic partner, and there will probably be other interventions and interreactions like that to bring partnerships and financing in to deliver this type of infrastructure. So Africa can be a center of that solution with the right amount and number of partners to be able to deliver this infrastructure and to deliver these solutions and the energy that's needed to create that sustainability that the whole planet needs.
Okay. So UAE would come in as a private investor. Obviously, they'd be looking for a return on their investment so that we have a win-win situation concerning all parties, I would certainly hope. Molly, let me stay with you. Africa 50 still invests in natural gas related infrastructure. What about fossil fuels? Is there any kind of investment in fossil fuels that you would accept?
I would say that we want to follow the will of our shareholders here, while at the same time balancing the large global movement towards clean and sustainable energy. Africa wants a balanced energy mix. It is going to have a clean and renewable future, but it must balance against the assets that it has. Natural gas is something that we're going to invest in, and because it is a transition fuel to renewables, it's something that we'll continue to do. In terms of the other fossil fuels, I would say we are not going to be looking at charcoal, for some unfortunately. But when it comes to the one in the middle, in terms of fuel oil, we have invested it only in the case where it can immediately be linked to natural gas. So I'm talking about a combined cycle gas plant in Senegal that we recently developed and built and commissioned from scratch. And that is actually kind of important because we did two things with that. The first was during the build-up and development of it, we made sure that it would have lower operational risks and actually be sure to have less fuel emissions in its operations than it would be just a regular sort of HFO plant. The second thing was that by using our standards in environmental, social, and governance guidelines, linking to policies of international standards, we were able to very quickly see and make sure that it would link to natural gas. So as you know, probably Senegal is actually due to have natural gas start producing within its country. As soon as the first molecule comes out of the ground in the country, that plant in Malikunda will switch immediately to natural gas. So those are examples of the types of investments that we'd be looking at with an eye to help meet the demands of the people, in this case in Senegal, while at the same time keeping an eye in the future to make sure that that sustainability is reached over time. One more thing I wanted to bring into the fore. If I know we're talking a lot about natural gas and everyone's kind of worried about the impact that that would have, but I'll leave this with you. If we tripled the production of natural gas in the continent, it would only add 0.67% to our total emissions, which is 4%. So let's just keep that in mind, shall we?
Right. And staying with the project in Senegal, the offshore natural gas production, and that's going to be used domestically, or are they? Would you imagine that a fair amount of that production is going to head elsewhere in the world?
No, I believe that's actually going to be domestic. It's going to be for the production and use of energy of Senegalese.
So that
and industry,
will,
actually.
Okay, so that's primarily to benefit the country itself, as opposed to pure export or some export.
Well, we realize the importance of both, of course, but we are very serious when we talk about the development of the continent.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Molly. If I can go back to Todd. Now, you had the ear, Todd, of decision makers at the State Department and the White House on matters concerning energy just a few years ago. How much has the thinking about energy needs changed since those days? Are we seeing a sort of a revolutionary new approach, or are we still basically on the same track from your days in when you graced the halls of the State Department?
So, look, obviously concerns about climate change are getting stronger. So there's been a bigger push for cleaner energy sources. But we have a term in the United States that we use for ourselves, which is called all of the above, which is that while we transition to a cleaner energy future, we are going to have a diversified energy mix. And we're going to try to manage that transition in a way that's not disruptive, especially to jobs and to energy prices. I just think we should expect all countries to behave that way. There's a wonderful professor at the University of Colorado named Roger Pilkey, and he's dubbed this the iron law of climate, which is that when climate policy comes into conflict with economic growth or with jobs, growth and jobs win every time. And so we should expect that. We've seen that in France, we've seen that in the United States, we're seeing that now in Canada, and we should absolutely expect that to hold in Senegal, Nigeria, Uganda as well.
Okay, slow progress, but hopefully slow but sure, with all the various projects that we anticipate hearing from COP28. Hopefully there'll be some resolutions that will actually be acted on, possibly a little bit more concretely than some have in the past, possibly. Thank you, Todd. Madam Ambassador, the West and some other countries, which I won't specify, I won't name, are the world's largest polluters and consumers of fossil fuels. Do you think they should be doing more specifically to help Africa combat the impact of climate change? And what would be the best thing that they could do? Is it just financing?
Yeah, basically, you've sort of answered the same question already, but let me put some light into it. But first of all, the world should understand that Africa, much as we want to move at the pace and also at the direction to which the whole world is going as far as meeting the climate change and so on, is not a significant contributor to what we are facing, the challenges that we are facing right now. But being in one globe, it doesn't mean we don't have a role to play, because you can't just wait to come and see challenges come to your doorsteps. You need to fight it as much as possible. What we are facing right now, first of all, we are asking the world to say, Africa should be allowed. I'm so happy with Todd that he speaks from the real experience, that in America they have what is called all of the above. And that's exactly what Uganda is also doing. Much as we are all gearing towards green gas emission and also climate change combatement, we are saying all of the above. That's why when you ask me about the fossil fuel, we are saying, yes, we don't ignore the fact that we should move out of this. But as of now, we need a mix of energy sources and energy contribution. But what we're also looking at is the challenge when it comes to financing. We are saying the West, that is actually the highest contributor to the challenge that the world faces now, should not sit back and think that for us we should only pay. It will not be paying, we would be looking at it as a punishment. So how do we come together and help one another to coexist in this globe? When our challenge is finances, and also you are able to support us through different mechanisms and also all sorts of financial institutions at the highest rate. Todd just said the cost of setting up a solar energy producing farm in the US would be as much less as setting up one in Ghana. And yet it is US that should have actually, in the real sense, they should be setting it free of charge without even those high costs. So it is my thinking that if we are to have a balanced movement towards meeting this challenge is, first of all, Africa should be helped to set up renewable energies, clean gas, and also expansion and bridging its financial challenges by one, providing enough and sufficient resources, financial resources, and also other technical resources that should be that should enable them to cope up with the level at which the world is moving, but not sitting back and asking Africa to do what West should be doing, and yet they also don't have the financial capacity to do it. So that will at least bring us to a very slow response, and yet the Africans are actually willing. But also we need a fair treatment, because if we are transiting, then we should be asking ourselves at what level are we transiting, and what capacity do we have to transit at the same pace. So that would be a fair deal.
All right, very clear answer, Madam Ambassador. Thank you. Adding a little bit more in detail to a topic that we have discussed in the past and will continue to discuss in the future, no doubt.
All right.
I have a question for Molly, and then we'll go to Todd as well. But Molly, coming to the point on financing, you mentioned African domestic investor potential. How big is that potential really, and how can domestic funds be channeled to investing in African energy? Is that clear in terms of the question? Okay, I'm not actually hearing Molly at the moment.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Do you want me to repeat that question, or are you okay?
I think I got it. So I think
got it.
you're asking how much potential our domestic resources have, and how they can potentially be channeled to meeting sort of these energy demands. Well, I can probably happily say that thanks to the very good practices of our pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, it has been estimated that combined, these institutional investors may have up to about $2 trillion in available funds. Now, that, of course, covers their constituents, their taxpayers, but there's a fair amount of that amount that could be used for investments. The trick with that, however, is from a fiduciary perspective, they need a type of investment that is stable, that has cash flows, that are sort of in the long term. For now, they have sort of used Western stable instruments, your state of US treasuries, to kind of give them the return that's required, as well as the safety of their investment. But I would go so forth as to say that infrastructure can also meet that need. And Africa 50 has actually been looking and developing potential ways of having these institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, what have you, actually channel in and investing in infrastructure overall. I would say probably using the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa is a great way for institutional investors to be able to get the visibility of the types of projects that they can invest in, And because it is an end-to-end structure and investments from after reaching financial close do still need that an equity and a debt investment, it's actually a pretty good vehicle that these institutional investors can invest into and get the types of returns that they're looking for, that stable, de-risked cash flows, particularly because of the intervention in project development, the high risks and perceived risks of that project has been made lower by bringing forward the types of interventions and analysis of risks, negotiations of that risk, and bringing in of institutional lenders to do so. So I guess it's a long, short way of saying by having partners and programs and innovations and products, it should be a bit easier now for these institutional investors to become and channel their ways in and invest in energy that they see fit.
Okay, all right. A lot of optimism there. Hopefully will come to fruition. Todd, you had some comments that you wanted to jump in and share with us?
Yeah, I wanted to follow on the ambassador's point
Yes.
about the responsibility being in the high emissions countries, which I know you don't want to name them, but I will. It's, you know, the United States and China are the two largest emitters. So obviously the action needs to be most aggressive there. And any sense of climate justice would salvage what's remaining in the global carbon budget. That is, how much more carbon we can put in the atmosphere without destroying the planet. What's left there, that should be prioritized for development and for the low emissions energy needy countries like in Africa. That's what climate justice would be about. Mm-hmm. But I just want our audience, I know we've had a lot of discussion around natural gas, and I actually don't think natural gas is core to the debates. It's an important piece, but it's just one small piece. And I think that it's very important, something I think that Molly said earlier, to highlight, which is that Africa is already getting the majority of its power from clean sources, and the pathway, because of how markets and technology are working, Africa will be on a clean energy future. So we should actually not be too worried about Africa blowing the global carbon budget, or Africa, ruining emissions efforts made in Europe and North America. Africa is simply not a threat to the global climate. And when you look at the scale, and I'll just point out Nigeria as a good example. Nigeria is the biggest economy and biggest population in Africa. It's also a carbon, it's a petroleum-based economy. So if any country in Africa you would think might be an emissions threat, it would be Nigeria. But if you look at Nigeria's long-term energy planning, they do want to put about 10 gigawatts of gas capacity into the system, but it's going to be vast majority based on solar and other clean energy technologies. And if you think that 10 gigawatts is a lot, it's not. The United States has over 550 gigawatts operating today, and we're adding about 10 gigawatts a year. And Nigeria just wants to add about 10 gigawatts by about 2040. So again, we should just not get too upset about Africa's emissions if they start to creep up a little, because there's no plausible, reasonable scenario where Africa becomes a global climate emissions. We could imagine, if Africa built thousands of coal plants, but that's just not going to happen. In fact, we just released an analysis of the coal pipeline in Africa. And other than 2 plants, one in South Africa and one in Zimbabwe, that are expanding, there are really no other coal plants that are likely to ever happen in Africa. So I think we can just turn down the rhetoric and stop gaslighting Africa that they're a potential climate problem, because they're not. They're already on a clean energy path, and we just want to help them get there faster so that we can accelerate development and especially create jobs on a growing continent.
Okay, so another positive, reassuring message there from Todd Moss in Washington, D.C. And also we heard from Molly earlier in terms of a somewhat optimistic, or hopefully verifiable optimistic outlook for the future. And I just want to end our discussion. We're sort of running out of time at the moment. I'll give the last word to Madam Ambassador here in the studio with me. What do you hope ideally will come out of COP28 next month? I mean, we've had 27 COPs so far. Are we making some progress? Is there anything you particularly want to see coming out of COP28? It's a wide open question for you there.
It's a little bit wide, but then what I look at is that a balanced perimeter for the whole world. That's what I look at, and also like my friend Todd, he has already said that Africa should not be put on a lot of pressure. In this discussion, they should have a very balanced thinking about Africa, just like any other part of the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at commitments that is positive and real, not that commitments that is said and then later on it's lags behind. That is what I'm looking at. That if it came in the next upcoming meetings or summit, I would be very optimistic that we would be gearing towards there. Mm-hmm. And as for Uganda, we are looking forwards to cooperate with the whole world, do everything possible to make sure that we move to a positive direction. Yes.
Right. Yes. I mean, we've seen too often in the past. I think we go 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back. And
that's true.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's brings us to the end of this, the first of 3 webinars brought to you by the Africa CEO Forum. So I would like to thank our panelists once again, Madam Ambassador Amula here in Paris. Thanks so much. Molly Bodimowo of Africa 50, who joined us from Casablanca. Thank you to you, Molly. And of course, Mr. Todd Moss, the Executive Director of the Energy for Growth Hub over in Washington, D.C. Thank you again. Not a particularly sociable hour for you to contribute, but nonetheless very much appreciated by us here and by our viewers as well. I'd like to thank those viewers that put in some questions to us. I think if we'd gone on even more, there'd have been many, many more questions that we'd have been able to turn to. So thank you so much for all our participants. And I wish everybody to stay well, and for now, goodbye from Paris.